All right, thank you, everybody. I haven't seen you in at least 30 seconds. This is wonderful. Um, look at that. So thank you all for remaining with us. So excited to have this conversation with Jesmyn Ward, whose book, Salvage the Bones, is it's just outstanding. So I highly encourage you to read it. It made the Atlantic's list as one of the great novels of the last 100 years. Jesmyn is a two-time National Book Award winner, a long list of accomplishments. But I'll just start with, I guess, the most recent accomplishment that's right here in our face. How did it feel to know your book made this list?
I read it, like read the list, I think yesterday, and I was, you know, I am rendered speechless. There's so many of the works and the writers on this list I admire, I grew up with, reading, their work sort of, resonates with me so strongly, and I feel like pointed me towards the kind of work that I wanted to attempt to do. So, it's just a real honor to be, on that list and to be part of that conversation, I think, that's taking place in the list.
One of the many things I love about your writing is that you write with a realness, but also a tenderness at the same time. And I think this is a very difficult combination for most, writers to really accomplish. You've said it a lot that you come from a family of storytellers. So where do you draw your inspiration from with your writing?
I write about, the kind of people who could be members of who could be people in my family, right? Or in my extended family, or in my community, right? And so I definitely draw inspiration, from my community, from my family, from the kind of people who live in the place where I live. I moved back home, even though everyone thinks I'm crazy for that.
And I tell everybody where home is.
I live in my hometown, which is DeLille, Mississippi. And part of the reason that I wanted to move back there is because I wanted to live and write in the place that inspired so much of my work. But I do come from a family of storytellers. So one of the first storytellers of my life is actually my maternal grandmother, right? Some of my earliest memories are of me either sitting on her lap or sitting near her at family gatherings, and her just, she had a whole, host of stories that she would tell about, like, her parents and their parents, and about herself and her, her early life, and about different people in the neighborhood. And she, some of those, I can't remember them word for word, but they definitely, I think, made an impression on me, and I think began to teach me how important it was to tell these stories, and I guess to sort of push back against, like, erasure and forgetting, because I feel like that's part of what she was doing and part of the reason why she would tell the stories that she would tell.
You speak often about how books were life-changing for you. How did you first start getting access to books?
So I was a library kid, really. And specifically...
Shout out to the library. I was too.
I was a library kid. Because back then, I don't even know where the nearest bookstore was. I grew up on the Mississippi coast, in a rural little town, in the 80s and through the mid-90s. And so I always, depended on either my school libraries or the local public library, which was actually in the next town over, because my town is so small that we don't actually have a public library. And I think that's one of the things that scares me most about the book bans, right? Especially, like, the amount of restriction and censorship that's happening in school libraries, because I know how important school libraries were to my reading life. I was like a as soon as I learned how to read, I was like a voracious reader, and I read everything that I could get my hands on. And even back then, I went to this little rinky-dink, school. My elementary school was really small, but still, I mean, the librarians, they were never pressured to limit what we had access to. And whatever I was curious about, whatever I picked up on the shelf, like I could read. And so it scares me, that like, that there, some schools, like 2 states over in Florida, right? Where, teachers they're so afraid they have like 2 books in their classroom, right? Like the dictionary is on the banned book list, which is insane. So I don't.
And your book is on the banned book list, right?
Right.
How does that make you feel as an author?
I mean, once again, I'm in good company. You know what I'm saying? Like it's sort of, flattering that, makes me feel like I'm doing something right? That I have written a book that, that has attracted the ire, right, of book banners. But on the other hand, jokes aside, it makes me angry, I think, because, even though I was a huge reader, when in elementary school, middle school, high school, I still felt like it took me I still felt like I didn't come to the books that I needed to read that gave me a clearer understanding of why, like how I grew up the way that I grew up, why I grew up, in a family, that had suffered through like generations of poverty, why I went to schools that were underfunded, and that didn't have a lot of resources. Like I didn't discover the books that I needed to read to help me figure out why that was the case until after I graduated from high school. And I am so grateful that I was able to discover those books, but I know that there are kids who, they need the stories that are being told in the books that are being banned. You know what I'm saying? Like these stories, I feel like these stories will enable, these kids to, they will like give them the keys to understanding their lives, right? And to understand these, these things that they're dealing with, right? And to take those keys, right, that lead to understanding away from children, I don't know, that makes me angry, and it breaks my heart too, because I feel like when I was writing Salvage the Bones, like in part, I was writing it for the Eshes out there. You know what I'm saying? I know that these girls exist, right? I know that they feel alienated and they feel silenced and they're trying to figure out how to navigate the world and how to understand, their sexuality and how to understand, what it means to, to be a teenager, to be a woman, to be a black person, to be a Southern person, like all these things, to be a straight person, like they're trying to figure all of this out. And I hope that Salvage the Bones is providing them with, some sort of like rubric to help them feel less alone and to help them figure out, what's going on in their lives, right?
That reminds me of the piece that you wrote for Harpers Bazaar last year, because there was something that you wrote in it that was just arresting. You wrote, "I wanted to read about black girls who subverted the will of this world, a world that said that when I grew up, I could expect to work as a housekeeper or a nursing home aide or a hotel maid or an assembly line in a factory if I was lucky. But I could never be a writer like Harriet or an explorer like Pippi or a warrior like Aaron. I hungered for affirmation, possibility, but all I got was erasure, and it tasted like air." How much did that mentality and perspective, like you said, you knew there were other Eshes in the world, how much did that drive you when you were creating her character in Salvage the Bones?
I mean, I feel like in part, one of the reasons that I wrote Esh is because I was, following the advice of the legend, the GOAT, Toni Morrison, right? And I'm paraphrasing here, right? But one of the things that she said was that you write the book that you want to read, right? And I think that, I wanted to read something like Salvage the Bones when I was a kid. I wanted to read something that would make me feel like I was visible, like I was seen, like someone else was out there struggling with the same thing that I was. And that person, because, Esh is a lot of things, but one of the things that she is she's a warrior, she's a caregiver. She also is, super smart, and she, she figures things out, right? I mean, she solves problems. She uses all of those things in order to survive her experience. And so in a way, like, she was capable, I think, of all the things that, that I wanted a character, who reflected more of my experience to be capable of in literature.
And as part of that, you also wrote about her, Hurricane Katrina is the backdrop of this entire story. And so why was it important for you to write about that and to preserve what that experience was like?
So I was home for Hurricane Katrina. I was in South Mississippi. I was in my hometown in DeLille. And it was pretty traumatic and terrifying, in a different way, perhaps. I have written about it before in essays, and in the conversation that was happening, like in, I guess, the media after, like in the aftermath of Katrina, I felt like people who had experiences like the one that I had, and who had experiences like the characters in my book, were being sort of silenced in that conversation and not included in that conversation. I heard different things that people said about Katrina, about people who didn't evacuate, right, before the storm. Someone I knew said, that was just stupid, why wouldn't they evacuate? Someone else I knew said, why would you go back and then rebuild? Like, why go back to that area after something like this happens? Because it's just gonna happen over and over again. Someone else, I overheard a conversation where these people were talking, and they're very religious, and I remember one person was saying, it was like God's judgment on this. I guess on New Orleans, and we're so sinful.
I was going to say that,
right.
New Orleans is the only city that sins,
right.
apparently.
We're sinful, so that's why God sent the hurricane to wipe us off the map. And so, like the real sort of lived experience, I think that a lot of people went through during Katrina wasn't part of that conversation. And that bothered me, because it made me realize that a lot of people just don't understand what life is like, for so many people down here who are like the characters in my book. And so many people, who are here in New Orleans who didn't evacuate, right? I mean, nobody evacuates because they want to go through some traumatic experience, right? Like, people don't choose to avoid evacuation because they want to test their mettle against a hurricane, right? People don't evacuate because they feel like they don't have that choice to evacuate, right? It's impossible for them for several different reasons. Or, where I come from, that is a component of it too, but another one of the reasons that people in my family and extended family and community don't evacuate is because there's so many of us. Like, it's it's not, we don't have the resources, right, to evacuate everyone that we care about. And so our, like the choice that we feel like we have to make is, okay, we're gonna stay here and we're gonna go through it together, right? And we're gonna do all the things that we've done for generations in order to survive this. And so I wanted that to be present on the page. I wanted that to be part of the conversation, those realities to be part of the conversation around Hurricane Katrina.
Give me a sense of like what your level of responsibility, how much of that you felt in writing about the place where you're from and about rural Southern Black people, period, because that is not, I mean, you want to talk about, a group of people that people act like they don't exist. Hence why all these wonderful political stories that whenever they talk about the rural South, they always wind up in a diner with all white people. But nevertheless, yeah, just give me a sense of like what kind of responsibility did you feel to how you wanted to present this to other people who have never heard of this place or do not often encounter people like this?
Right. I think I still feel a strong sense of responsibility to tell the stories of the kind of people that I come from, of the people in my community. And that has motivated me since the beginning of my career. I have struggled with it because I feel like there's some, I don't know, pushback against it because, I come from a poor background. I come from a background where, my like the reality of how people live and how people have lived for generations in the place that I'm from. I mean, my grandmother used to tell stories about sundown towns. She had her own, experiences with sundown towns. One of my great-great-grandfathers was killed by a squad of like revenue agents, right? A lot of the people in my family, my extended family in my community, like they have struggled with substance abuse, right? As I said before, generations of people in my family have like lived in poverty. There are plenty of people in my family now who still, struggle and who still, who still are struggling to make it, who still would consider, I think many would consider them to still like live in poverty, right? And so I feel the responsibility to tell our stories because I feel like we have not been present in the sort of landscape of literature, right? But I have to be honest about it, right? So I have to write, if I choose to write about the people that I write about, I have to be honest about the conditions of their lives, right? I have to be honest about the poverty. I have to be honest about the dysfunction. I have to be honest about their struggles with substance abuse. I have to be honest about all of it, right? And I feel like, I don't know, I think that there's, that sometimes readers can, I don't know, can push back against that somewhat. But I feel like something that I've been thinking about a lot, in the past, basically since, in the past like 3-4 years, is about what it means to witness, what it means to bear witness, right? And that, I feel like that is part of my job as a writer because I am choosing to tell the stories that I tell about the people that I am writing about, right? Like I have to bear witness. I have to be honest. And that honesty has to bear itself out on the page. As you were saying earlier, I try to balance it with tenderness. I try to balance it with, what Clint Smith was talking about earlier. Like I try to make my characters as complicated and as complex as I can, right? So that the reader feels as if they are living this experience with this person that is probably nothing like them, right? And my hope is that I make the reader through that experience, the reader feels empathy, right, for the people that I'm writing about, and then they take that empathy out into the real world. That's my hope.
Well, I think you amazingly accomplished both because while I've certainly never experienced something like Hurricane Katrina, and while I am familiar with poverty, having grown up in poverty, but just in Detroit, the characters in Salvage the Bones, in all of them, there was something we all can easily relate to dreaming, to being insecure, to like all these other more bigger, broader elements. I want to ask you though, in light of, the book banning that we discussed, in light of just the overall attack on intellectualism, period, that this country seems to be under and embracing, sadly, why, in your opinion, does fiction writing or fiction as a genre, period, still matter?
Because I think that that fiction does something that movies can't necessarily do, that maybe television can't necessarily do. I think there's something about the act of reading, right, that enables a reader to sink into an experience and be immersed in an experience with another person, right, like with a character, and to impart, I think that experience feels lived in a way that it doesn't necessarily, it may not feel, I don't think you get that same experience, in other types of media, but in fiction, I feel like that happens, right? Every time I surface, that's why I use that language, right? Every time I surface from like reading a book, I feel like I've lived that experience, right? And again, like that experience of being with another person, of living with them, of hearing them speak, of feeling what they feel, of sympathizing with them, of empathizing with them, I think that does have real world, I think that does inspire change, right, in the real world, like outside of the book. I feel like it's one of the reasons why, I feel I feel like, things go in cycles, and so I don't know. I feel like 10 years ago or 14, 15 years ago, when I was sort of just entering, trying to get published and like entering the publishing industry, there was all this like panic over, books, right? Like, people aren't reading anymore. No one's gonna read ever again. Like, but I don't know. Even with what is happening now, right? With like this, this hysteria, and in this terrible, trend of banning books. I think that, that fiction, that what you can get from fiction, you can't get anywhere else. And so I think that we will continue to read, and I think that we're gonna come out of this moment, because so many people are pushing back against this. So many people, writers, librarians, book lovers, critics, like so many people are pushing back against this, this erasure, right, of stories. I think that, hopefully, I think that we're gonna have this real flowering, I think. And we're gonna come, we're gonna, I really do feel like, we'll always read. I feel like stories will always matter. Fiction will always matter. And I think there's going to be like a real flowering after this.
I hope you are correct. I should also mention, Jesmyn has graciously agreed to read a portion of Salvage the Bones, but we'll get to that in a moment. I wanted to ask you this first before we get to that. You also are an English professor here at Tulane, as many people know. How are you seeing this sort of attack on, intellectualism, the book bans? As a professor, how are you seeing this show up maybe in students in the classroom? What has that experience been like?
I mean, I think so far I've been really lucky. I haven't really seen it yet. I mean, maybe it might, give me, I don't know, in, 5 to 10 years or so, when, kids who, are in middle school, high school, elementary school, high school now, like when they get, to the university or they reach university age, then maybe I'll see more of it. But I mean, I love Tulane. I'm really grateful for my experience here at Tulane, where, I have total freedom to teach, whoever I want to teach and whatever work that I want to teach. Clint Smith is, I actually teach his poetry, right, in my intro to creative writing class, right? Like, I teach him, I teach, Dana Smith, I teach Jericho Brown, right? And they're all, wonderful poets and wonderful writers. And so I haven't really, I feel like it has not impacted me as much, which I'm really grateful for.
Do you feel any conflict at all or how do you reconcile the conflict? Is that you love your hometown, even though, I mean, I understand you have a complex relationship with it, as we often do with the places that we're from. It's a place that clearly shaped you, informed your writing, but it's also a part of a hotbed where they're trying to silence people like you. So how do you reconcile those two things?
I don't think that I've reconciled it. I mean, I feel like I struggle with it day in and day out. It's difficult. It's difficult. Because I have children. I have 3 children now, so I think about what it means for them what it is going to mean for them to grow up in a place, like Mississippi, right? And, I worry because, as I said earlier, like one of the things that I struggled with when I was a kid was, I didn't have the information that I needed in order to understand why I lived the kind of life that I live, right? And why I had to struggle in the ways that I did, and why my family had to struggle, my family members had to struggle, in the ways that they did. And so, I guess that's like one of my fears, right? Like that, that because the stories that provide my kids with like the keys to understanding why, why the place that we live in is the way that it is. Like, if those stories are taken away from them, right, that bothers me. It's difficult to live in a place where you live with people who, I don't know, like I often, when I'm interacting with my neighbors, it's difficult to live in a place where that some of your neighbors doubt your humanity. You know what I'm saying? Like that they think you are less than. That they're everything about their politics is an expression of that, right, fact that they doubt your humanity, right, and they think you deserve less. And so I don't know. I still struggle with it, and I have not reconciled myself to it. I guess the way that I push back against it is through my work.
Well, speaking of, if you would do us the honor of reading an excerpt here from Salvage the Bones, which if you have not read, again, please go buy the book. It's excellent. I tried to to limit it to a page, but I failed. So I'm going to read like 2 pages, if that's okay. So this comes from the end of from the next to last chapter of the book, when Hurricane Katrina hits
Salvage the Bones follows a family where, there's a father who's sort of absent, and then there are 4 children. Esh is the second child. She's the only girl. Um, and and so Salvage the Bones follows them in the 10 days preceding Hurricane Katrina. So in this excerpt that I'm about to read, Hurricane Katrina has hit, and the storm has been going on probably for a couple of hours now. And so the family is sheltered in place in their house. They've done all those things that you do to get ready for a hurricane. They've boarded over the windows. They've gotten canned goods. They've gotten batteries and light sources and filled up their tubs with water, right? And so that's where we're entering the book. Junior, Randall says, I know you ain't pee yourself. Junior leans over, touches the ground beneath his butt, his face, and his thighs. I didn't do that. Then why it's all wet over here? We have been sitting in the living room, terrified and bored. I'm trying to read by the oil lamp, but the sound of the words are not coming together over the sound of the wind and the rain relentlessly bearing down on the house. They are fragments. She's reading Edith Hamilton's Greek mythology. Jason has remarried, and Medea is wailing. An exile, O God, alone. And then, by death, oh, by death shall the conflict be decided. Life's little day ended. I shut the book, don't even mark my place, and sit on it. I'm cold. Skeeta and China look like they've fallen asleep, his hand on her flank and her breastbone on his knee. But when Randall says this, their eyes open to slits at the same time. China is Skeeta's pit bull. The half deck of Uno cards that Randall had been attempting to teach Junior how to play stick to the floor around Junior's legs. I shrug out of my covers. The thin stream of air that whispers from under Daddy's door brushes past me like a boy in a school hallway, insistent and brusque. And why are my shorts wet? Is it gone? Am I bleeding? Shouldn't I be cramping? I stand. The floor underneath me is dark. China rolls to her feet, her teeth out, and Skeeta grabs her by her scruff as she lunges. He holds her still. He stands, looking calmly about the room. It's water. It's coming in the house, Skeeta says. Ain't no water coming in the house. We're just getting a little damp from the rain, Daddy says. It's coming up through the floor, says Skeeta. Ain't nowhere for it to come from. Daddy waves at the room, waves like he's stopping one of us from giving him something he doesn't want. His antibiotics, a letter from a teacher, a school fundraising brochure. Look, Randall says, and he walks over to the window facing the street and bends like an old man peering out. A lot of trees on the road. But you don't see no water, Daddy says. No. Skeeta and China walk past Junior, who stands where Randall left him in front of the sofa. Junior is picking up each foot, setting it down. He looks at the bottoms as if he cannot believe that he has feet and that they are wet. He pulls his shorts away from him, but they stick anyway. Skeeta peers out of the window with China next to him. There, Skeeta says. Randall and I run to the window at Skeeta's side, but Junior is there first, and we are all over each other, our feet wet, the carpet a soaked sponge where we stand, Daddy looking at the window like it isn't boarded up, like he can see through it. There is a lake growing in the yard. It moves under the broken trees like a creeping animal, a wide-nosed snake. Its head disappears under the house where we stand, its tail wider and wider, like it has eaten something greater than itself, and that great tail stretches out behind it into the woods, towards the pit. China barks. The wind ripples the water, and it is coming for us. There is water over my toes. The pit, Randall sighs. Daddy gets up then, walks slowly over to the window, each bone bent the wrong way in each joint. Randall moves so Daddy can see out of the crack. No, Daddy says. I shift, and the water licks my ankles. It is cold, cold as a first summer swim. China barks, and when she jumps down from the window and bounces, there is a splash. Daddy? Randall says. He puts his arm over Junior, who, cringing with his eyes wide, hugs Randall's leg. But for once, Randall's arm doesn't look like metal, like ribbon, like stone. It bends at the elbow, soft, without muscle, and looks nothing but human. Daddy, Junior squeals, but he buries his face in Randall's hip, and Randall's hip eats the end of the word. Junior rises an inch or so. He must be on his toes. The water is up to the middle of my calf. Look, I say. There is something long and dark blue between the trees. It is a boat. Someone has come to save us. But then I squint and the wind lags clear for 1 second, and it is not a boat, and no one has come to save us. It is Daddy's truck. The water has picked it up, pushed it from the pit. The snake has come to eat and play. Your truck, Skeeta says. Daddy begins to laugh.
In this business, we call that a tease. Hopefully that will inspire you to buy the book. Please enjoy the complete reading list of The Atlantic, the greatest novels of the last 100 years. Remember, just 1 hour a day for the next 5 years, and you too can complete that list. Thank you all. Have a good evening.